Good morning and welcome to the Daily Ding here on the Athletic NBA Show. I'm Jared Weiss. Andrew Schlecht is our producer, and today for our writer series, we are joined by the Athletic national writer Sam Amick. Sam, you opined on something that happened with one of our other reporters earlier. It was back in April, I think, this year, where Giannis and our Bucks reporter Eric Name had a fascinating interaction that kind of took over the entire industry for a little while. So just tell me what you remember from that moment and why you wrote about it.
Well, thank you for having me, Jared. I love this series, and I'm humbled that you gave me the invite. So this will be fun. Giannis and the Bucks fall in the playoffs, and they fall in their attempt to repeat what they did a couple years back and win the NBA championship. Giannis takes the press conference podium and is asked a question by the gentleman who you mentioned, our friend and colleague Eric Name, Bucks beat writer, about whether or not he saw this season as a failure because the Bucks had fallen short. And as everybody, I think most people anyway, listening are probably aware, Giannis gave an incredibly interesting answer that, if I had to guess, was in the neighborhood of 2.5 minutes. Pretty lengthy, thoughtful answer that he even admitted had been sitting in the back of his mind for, you could say, at least a year, because he'd been asked this question before by Eric, and shared with the world that he didn't like his answer previously, and knew that at some point, somebody would ask him this philosophical question again. And, to paraphrase his answer, it was that in sports, there is no failure, that it's all part of the journey. If Michael Jordan won 6 titles in all the years that he played, is every other year a failure? And Giannis was framing sports really on the whole as a place where, you are winning so long as you grow, so long as you advance, so long as you never give up and you never quit. There's all kinds of life lessons that come from that. I actually thought his answer was just fantastic. Again, bigger than basketball, but a lot of the reaction, I thought, and mostly on social media, was negative. And there was a lot of that sense of, oh, that reporter got owned, and look at the way Giannis, what a stupid question. And there was all this negativity going Eric's way, and really forget about just Eric, as much as I love him, but too much negativity as part of this conversation that I think otherwise should have been really interesting. And one of those, like, who cares what side of the fence you're on? Like, what an interesting question, and what a thoughtful response from the athlete, which, as reporters, as you know very well, that's the dream, right? Is to get athletes to be honest, candid, open, transparent in the kind of way that Giannis was. So when I saw a lot of the reaction that just didn't seem, I thought, to kind of properly reflect where the discussion should be, I decided to jump in and write about really behind the scenes media stuff that I normally would never touch. And we talked about this off air briefly a moment ago. I'm friends with Eric. A couple of years back when the Bucks won the title, beat the Suns, and had that whole journey, I was with Eric every single day for a pretty lengthy amount of time during the playoffs, home and road. That's just kind of the playoff life when we cover these teams. And I saw the relationship between Eric and Giannis, and I learned more about how much respect Giannis has for him. And that was a lot of the nuance I thought was not part of the discussion about the press conference, was that I think Giannis's choice to not get more upset with the question and to be so thoughtful and to share his insight had a lot to do with the respect that he had for Eric. At one point, he even says, you remember, Jared, I don't want to make this personal, but he's talking to Eric about his life. What is success for you? Is it, helping your parents get a home? Is it paying your bills? He just, this very relatable answer. But I thought a lot of that nuance and context needed to be a part of it.
And so you started with a text that you got from an executive. Can you just walk us through that scene?
Yes. So, and I can't share all the details, but this season, the last season, I guess, I wrote a column that an executive didn't care for about, his team. And this is just par for the course. We are constantly, again, as you know, either getting, praise or criticism based on what we write. But when you write some of the tough stuff, part of the gig is not everybody's going to be happy with you. So I write this piece, and I get a text from the executive that essentially says, I hope you wrote this column with Chat GPT so you didn't waste your time with this drivel. And I'm, not a direct quote, but that's pretty close. I've remembered drivel and Chat GPT very specifically. And the reason I use this at the top of the Giannis column was because from that interaction, and beyond, working in this industry in this generation, I feel, especially with things like artificial intelligence, obviously growing at an incredible rate, and with people generally, I don't think having a ton or maybe enough respect for actual journalism, real reporters, objectivity, all those things. There was this undercurrent of condescension with that text that essentially the message I took from it was, you know, the robots are coming. Your jobs eventually in the not so distant future are going to be obsolete. And I didn't love the text. Now, to this person's credit, again, without getting into it, they later went on to acknowledge it, apologize, and when I wrote this column, even on the back end, we had a fun little interaction where they did acknowledge that they saw this column and joked about how I got my revenge. So all's well that ends well. But that anecdote, I thought, kind of touched the spirit of the way people reacted to Eric in the Giannis interaction, where people are so quick to be very dismissive about the reporters who are trying to provide fans with insight, coverage. Again, objectivity being a very important part of what we try to do. Especially, I'm going to sound like a commercial here, Jared, but a lot of the media entities that cover these different leagues are compromised in a pretty significant way when it comes to partnerships. And every time, you shake that hand when it comes to those partnerships, in my opinion, you then compromise some objectivity. So I loved what Eric asked. I loved the answer it elicited. And I had just wished that the response was a little more up that alley.
But at the same time, it did give you a chance to write a really good story and then talk about it months later on this podcast.
I
And
appreciate it. It was fun to write. I mean, it was, and when you got, I got a lot of nice notes on the column, and it was pretty neat. Again, because I'm not a media columnist. I'm not Richard Deitch, who does a great job covering the media for the Athletic, or any of the other people who are in that part of our industry. I don't write about what we do very often. And so when you get notes from people in the industry saying thank you for sharing some of those views, because beyond the Giannis interaction, the general idea was that fans should really want these kinds of objective reporters in the space of the athletes. Like, trust us. If it's nothing but, and no offense to the folks over here, but if it's nothing but bucks.com and suns.com and a lot of these entities that where the checks are getting paid by the teams, you're not going to get the actual coverage. You're not going to really understand what's truly happening with the players and the teams. And I think fans should celebrate that from the Athletic and beyond. But sometimes they're real quick to criticize. Apologies. The dog just saw the mailman here, Jared.
classic movie. It's funny because there are probably even last year plenty of times where I've gotten owned and I turned into a meme or people are making fun of me. And I usually look at that as a good sign that I'm asking the right questions. And most of the time it's because I challenge them. Sometimes my question was just stupid. And I guess,
Oh, sure.
I'm sure I asked plenty of those. People take bad shots throughout the game. It's like, it's part of the job.
I
But
love the humility, though. You're so quick to say, I'm sure I asked some. That is important. And I still have to work on that. Like, it's okay to admit that not every question you ask is great. Even yesterday, this relates. Friend and colleague Vinny Goodwill from Yahoo Sports had asked NBA Commissioner Adam Silver a couple of very relevant questions at the Board of Governors meeting. And I noticed a lot of the replies on X, as we now call it, regarding his question on the Knicks. So, not to get too far afield, but Leon Rose, head of the Knicks front office, doesn't do any media. Vinny asked Adam if there was any accountability that the Knicks needed to kind of answer for, with Leon not speaking to the fans, not speaking to the media. A lot of the replies were folks just going after Vinny. We don't care. Why are you hung up on this? Just killing Vinny. And I'm a little bit like the Eric and Giannis thing. I'm reading all these replies going, don't you guys get it? Like, the reason he wants to talk to Leon is so you can get better perspective on why they're building the team the way they are and why it's either working or not working. But, more often than not, that part seems to be lost on folks.
that kind of ties into the chat GPT aspect of this is trying to understand what's the difference between a reporter and a what eventually will probably be a good enough chatbot that it can write just as well. And it's that we give access at this point. Who knows?
Right.
Maybe Giannis will want to talk to a chatbot to leak all of his information and tell his story in the future. But like even with the rise of the Players Tribune and this whole new media thing and Draymond Green becoming a podcaster, all these guys becoming podcasters, it's like the journalists, one, know how to pull a certain type of story for sure. We've seen like a lot of these player podcasters are able to get players to open up because of the whole kind of mutual respect factor, but the conversation doesn't always elicit the kind of storytelling that the fan would want. But there's pluses and minuses to both sides. But at the end of the day, having somebody that is both independent and can utilize actual human social relationships to tell a certain story or to hold a certain level of accountability, that's like it's not that it's drastically different than what would happen if we just kind of removed independent media, but it's kind of crossing that line from being subjective and objective. It's, even though it seems small, it is a massive difference, and it's kind of an important part of getting a complete picture to mesh with the like broadcast coverage that's going to be a lot more down the middle and friendly to everybody.
Couldn't agree more. Ironically or fittingly, today it was highlighted to me that the chairman of the New York Times, A.G. Sulzberger, had actually written a 12,000 word essay a couple months back on independence in media and the importance of it, and a pretty powerful message about why it is everything in the climate and the context that you're talking about, whether it's AI or just the internet, the nature of the internet in general. More than ever, the point that he was making in part was that it's going to be harder and harder to figure out, where the reliable, accurate, objective information is versus the junk, for lack of a better way of putting it.
Yeah, between the kind of social media feeding of creating content that is easy to consume, is digestible to the masses, that's polarizing, having the editorial standard to be able to kind of avoid falling into those traps and create stuff that's both accurate and actually layered. And just the fact that if we take away independent media, it means that the sources of the information get to have full control over what information gets out there.
No
And
question.
yeah, and they're just gonna.
And I know we're not highlighting this story too much, but this past season, another one that comes to mind is LeBron and I had a conversation mid-season about how he was looking at the trade deadline and the Lakers' struggles at the time. It was a walk and talk one-on-one post press conference where he shared a few honest thoughts about how the Lakers had been building their roster. And on the back end of that, of course, he jumped on it was still Twitter at the time, and tried to, he pushed back and then tried to clarify what he had told me in our interview. But the reality is, in that exchange, is that that discussion that's coming with a question that is not sanitized, not approved by a team, approved by a PR person. It's an objective reporter question about, how do you see this? How do you see that? I truly believe and strongly believe you got real honesty and truth and how he saw things at the time, even maybe more than he cared to share, and realized that on the back end when he saw it in print. But that's part of what we do, is to not just have these kind of humdrum press conferences where you don't learn anything.
That's the part I've always struggled with press conferences and interviews, and just I see this more like political reporting with the whole like, you were on the record, you said it, so it has to be on the record now. And I guess having maybe flexibility about on the record versus off the record things. But when you're talking in real life and you're asked a difficult question, you have to answer it immediately. It's really hard to say exactly what you want to say.
No
Sometimes your
question.
instinctive reaction might not be what you actually truly feel when you have a moment to think about it. And so I guess as someone that's been around long enough to, while you're still a very young, handsome man, has been around long enough to see the evolution of the way coverage has drastically changed over the last like 10 to 15 years. How do you feel how do you feel people in the spotlight are talking nowadays, if it's different, and the way that we hold people accountable to, or I guess hold people to their initial word, does that have to change considering the way that like quotes disseminate so rapidly now and also get kind of cut apart and taken out of context a lot of the time?
Yeah, I think partly what you're hitting on is the question on the media side is, do you empathize with how challenging it is for the people being covered? The answer is I do. And I think we all got to continue to find solutions there, because I can't imagine. I've had a handful of experiences where I got interviewed for something, it came out and the shoe was on the other foot, right? Where I saw something I said and it wasn't exactly how I remembered it. I do kind of know what that feels like. You probably deal with this a lot of times. We'll do interviews with sports radio stations, and you'll just jump on and talk shop. And next thing you know, you look at social media and they're highlighting like absolutely the most controversial thing that you said, even if you didn't intend to be controversial.
Mhm.
these athletes are dealing with that every single day. And social media means that nothing gets, lost in the shuffle. Everything, if it's compelling, if it's interesting, if it is, and let's be honest, if it is controversial, it gets highlighted. So that's why you see the reticence from a lot of the athletes. That's why, I guess to take it back to Eric and Giannis, that's why relationships like that are I think so neat and so unique, is that you have trust built up over years where, Giannis has not had a lot of moments. I think I'm confident in saying this, where he saw something Eric wrote and said, man, he really tried to get me there. It's just not how Eric has covered him. And that goes back to the value of us being, given the access to be around these athletes and to try to provide what I think is a pretty unique service for the fans.
So that brings us to what probably is the most important report of your entire career. And
That's a
that's what
very
happened.
sad statement.
So, tell us what happened during the NBA Finals. Probably the most important thing that happened on the court in Game 4.
So yeah, game four, Jared, comes to an end. The Nuggets win 108-95. It's interesting, at the time I had no idea, but right after the game, I'm running to go do what we do and get to press conferences and locker room availability. And on the way, the incredibly famous fighter, MMA superstar Conor McGregor, was leaving the arena. I saw him leaving with his whole group about 20 minutes after the game. So in the third quarter, Conor McGregor, who, to my knowledge, and I think this is 100% accurate, doesn't really have any real ties to the Miami Heat. He's not, I don't think, a fan favorite. I don't think he's a guy that they're used to highlighting in that neck of the woods. But he comes out and has a promotion to pump his pain relief spray, and he gets out there with Bernie, the Heat mascot, and essentially they're gonna pretend that they're fighting. And it appears that the bit is supposed to be that Connor, gives Bernie, kind of a fake Hollywood punch, no big deal. Bernie goes down, and then Connor is going to spray him with that spray because pain relief. Hey, there you go. There's the bit. But it's up on the Jumbotron. And when he goes to deliver the punch, and I was not sitting close to the floor, as you know, in the finals, seating's pretty challenging. I'm pretty far away, but I'm watching intently, both on the screen and down on the floor. And in real time, like it 100, I don't know how it hit you, but 100%, my first thought was, wow, that did not look fake. Like he absolutely swung on him. Bernie hit the deck pretty hard. And then, for good measure or bad measure, I suppose, when Bernie's down on the floor, Connor gives him one more just right in the face. And he's obviously wearing a costume, but those things aren't that thick. So people were talking about it that night, that this was kind of crazy. Like, there's no way that was completely scripted, part of the plan. And essentially, again, for lack of a better way of putting it, it was like, what an asshole. And that was kind of how people were reacting to it.
It's a
Fast
normal reaction
forward.
with him.
What was that?
It's a normal reaction for Conor McGregor, it
Yeah, no
seems.
doubt. And listen, and the stuff that later was alleged that night is fairly unspeakable, and we don't know where that case is going to go. But for the purposes of this part of that evening, folks were focused on that fight, and it didn't make a lot of sense. So fast forward to the next day. One of the my favorite parts of NBA Finals coverage is that there is an NBA media charter plane that we pay for, but if you want to, you have the option to fly in between the two cities on a plane that is, essentially commissioned by the NBA through Delta. And I have done it for years and years and years. I find it to be way more convenient than trucking in the airport. Cost wise, it's pretty similar. And more importantly, and I've argued this even before the Athletic, the USA Today, to their credit, green lighted me doing this because of the value. You get on this plane, and a lot of times you are surrounded by NBA people. And so, for reporting purposes and for relationship purposes, and this kind of dovetails into the Giannis discussion a little bit, like we are constantly trying to have as much engagement with people of influence within the NBA as possible. So on this plane, there's been years where you were a couple rows away from Kiki Vandeweghe, who was the longtime disciplinarian of the NBA and former NBA player. High-ranking people within the league are often on this plane. A lot of PR people, a lot of staffers, but bottom line, there is a value in being around this crowd. So the part I can share, because obviously we don't ever share our sources or completely pull the curtain back on where we got stuff. But I think, this part I don't mind sharing is I'm on that flight. And as we're getting ready to go, we're all sitting in this room. And obviously, this is outside of Miami at the Miami airport in a private wing. The plane wasn't ready yet. And there's just chatter all around. People are waiting to grab their bags and get on the plane. And in casual conversation, I happened to overhear some chatter about Connor and the fact that when he hit Bernie, that it was not only not scripted, but Bernie had gone to the hospital and that he was actually pretty, seriously hurt. Now, before listeners make a faulty assumption, because again, we all know that everybody's skeptical of reporters. I've had people ask me, well, that wasn't enough to report it, right? Well, of course not. That's just now something's on your radar. Now the question becomes, wow, that's interesting. It's not the normal type of thing that I cover. I usually just stick to actual NBA figures, not MMA fighters and mascots, but it's the finals and it's a high profile type of thing. So I decide to basically check with people both on the ground there and then people remotely, via text and email, and start digging in to see if where there's smoke there's fire. Wasn't able to get to it right away on the ground, had no luck. We eventually get on the plane. Now I'm dealing with just Wi-Fi. I'm up in the air. I'm 30,000 feet. I'm exchanging notes. Again, I think this is fine to share with our esteemed NBA editor, who, by the way, congrats, got a fantastic, well-deserved promotion recently, Sergio Gonzalez. Sergio and I are going back and forth talking about this story. I tell him what I heard. I tell him I'm trying to confirm it. But the most comical part to me that I'll always remember is that from a journalistic standpoint, I'm asking Sergio, like, Sergio, am I really going to report this? Like, is this a story? You know what I mean? Like, we got MMA guy hits mascot. None of these guys are named LeBron. This is not my beat, but I mean, it is interesting. And to his credit, he was like, yes, absolutely. Like, this is the NBA finals. If you can confirm it, then we're going to go with it. So, not too long after, was able to get confirmation, very rock solid, concrete confirmation. And if you saw the little grin on my face as I'm writing this newser, it's just because of the silliness of it all at the time. And not to make light at all of, the man who plays Bernie's, medical situation. Because the more we learn later, he was laid out pretty good. But just kind of the absurdity of the nature of this news story. So I'm putting it together. And Jared, I mean, I'm looking at that screen like, man, what is my lead? Like, how am I like, so short and sweet. I forget how many words it was, maybe 150. It wasn't a very long story. Now, story's ready to rock, story's getting published. And now comes the social media part that we always deal with, right? The other memory I have is me letting Sergio know that this was so unconventional for me that I didn't really know how I wanted to share the story on Twitter. And I actually thought for a moment to be somewhat light with it, like, some qualifier, like not my normal type of news, but FYI, this happened. His advice was just play it straight. Just, source, here's what happened. And I've been lucky enough to have a lot of these type of stories over the years, but in terms of just absolute kind of social media explosion effect or component, this was up there. I mean, I tweeted out, and he was the one who had said, "Trust me, I think you're underestimating how big of a star Connor is," and then also the incredibly passionate mascot community. Like Zach Lowe of ESPN has cornered the market on mascot stuff and kind of showing the world that people love anything mascot related. So I share it. Story goes nuts. It obviously ends up getting a ton of eyeballs and easily just one of the most unique news breaks I've ever had.
Playing it straight's the right call because I'm a big fan of trying to less is more, especially with humor. And when something is so absurd like that, it's such a ridiculous thing to report. It's already hilarious. You don't need to make the point.
Well, and to
Just
your
playing it straight
point,
is gonna make it funny.
that's the thing. I think if I had qualified it, I would have missed out on the chance to enjoy all the humor that came my way with the reaction, because
Mhm.
me playing it straight immediately led to just a flood of tweets where it was like, because I didn't acknowledge the silliness factor at all, then that was what people, they just, they would retweet it with either eyes open emoji or just like, I'm sorry, what? Like what world is this where, this is what we're reading about. But yeah, it was a little different, buddy.
No, well, this is how breaking the big news during the NBA Finals works, folks. Honestly, it's probably the most memorable thing from that finals. I mean, there's a lot of great work done during that series, but that's the thing that sticks out the most.
Well, and it is, I mean, shoot, this is, I mean, they're both serious stories, but it reminds me of even earlier in the playoffs. I was covering Kings Warriors, and you had the controversy where E40 got ejected from his front row
Oh,
seat. Like when you get to the playoffs, there is a, call it a pop culture component, or it's just the magnitude of the stage and the people who come to see these games. As a reporter, I think you do have to broaden your lens a little bit in terms of what you're looking at, because you're not talking about a regular season game in December.
all right. Well, he's the best. His name is Sam Amick, covers the NBA for us here at The Athletic. Andrew Schlecht is our producer, and I'm Jared Weiss, and we will see you next time on The Ding.
Thank you, Jared.